Welcome to today's webinar. The focus will be on a review of 2024 and an open discussion of looking ahead, which I call just a chat. But I will be steering this discussion for those of you that are just checking in toward a topic that I think is bubbling just below the surface and periodically erupts. And I'm going to erupt. It's almost volcanic when I look at how seismic the issue is that I'm going to raise with you today. But it seems to be an issue that it hasn't been openly discussed, and I'd like to discuss the various dimensions of it today. So here goes. I came to Canada in 1964. For those that you might remember, it was just before the Vietnam War, but it was a time when Watts was burning. There were riots in Detroit. The Democratic Convention was not particularly peaceful. And it was pretty obvious to me that while I was coming to Canada to get a graduate degree, that I was a little happy to cross that border and get away from a perpetuation, a tolerance for a fascination, almost a romanticizing of the frontier, of the revolution, of violence as characteristic of a gun-carrying and supportive nation, and going into one that seemed a little bit more peaceful. And as I arrived and lived in Canada, it was hard from time to time to see that there was really very much of a difference, except along the lines of violence, whether it was wars that might be justified as sustaining democracy on a world scale, or maybe it was knowing that the number of deaths a day in Chicago was something in the order of 50. But something began to define itself in my life that did make a difference. And only recently, as I was putting together a reflection on what we've talked about in 2024, and whether it be our newsletters or webinars, we talked about homelessness. We've talked about some of the challenges in education today. We've talked about some of the challenges in municipal governments of dealing with things like wokeism. Just below the surface, there has been this continuing discussion of almost a socio-emotional transformation underway, or tension. And when I put the statistic in the reflection of 2024, it read, the event, I cited Syria's collapse and Trump's resurrection, the word polarization, this continued segregation of our political and social spheres. I had to choose Taylor Swift, whether it was out of humor, but she seemed to be a phenom, and while a billionaire, she's also a philanthropist. But by contrast with Donald Trump, who was a close second, I said he's trying hard and continues to command global attention. But the question was, would Donald blink with his 25% tariffs and his 54 state humor, whether it was directed at Canada, Greenland, or Panama? But the one that hit me the most, and the one I want to talk about today, is the shocking statistic, as if the U.S. is at war with itself, with 850,000 firearm-related deaths in the U.S. since 2001. That's not war-related. That is citizens inside the United States not wearing a military, or maybe wearing a military reform and returning. But half of those dying of the 850,000 are men. Suicide, majority under 50 years of age. Canada is less so. It's still high, but it's still less so. The totals exceed total U.S. military deaths since 2001, since the origin of the United States, that equate to 750,000. So we've had 100,000 more deaths since 2001 through firearm-related deaths in the U.S. than all of the wars combined that the U.S. has been involved in. And more than those in the Civil War, which, for those of you who know, 750,000 died in the Civil War. That statistic shocked me to the point that 2 nights ago, I woke up with an insight. And that insight led to me spending 2 hours between 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning writing this book. And the book is called Feminization, the Cause and the Cost. Now, you wonder where I've come up with feminization after this talk about violence in the U.S. The 20th century has ushered an unprecedented change in how societies function, placing gender dynamics at the forefront of this transition. This phenomenon of feminization, the increasing influence of traditionally feminine values such as empathy, collaboration, and inclusivity, has reshaped institutions, policies, cultural norms. This shift is both the cause for celebration and a source of tension as it challenges long-standing structures and roles. And the challenge is the defining characterizations of what some call toxic masculinity. Today's world is markedly different from that of our parents and grandparents. Women now surpass men in educational attainment, occupy power positions in politics and business, and drive cultural and social movements. However, these advances bring challenges. Men face evolving expectations, and traditional industries and gender roles are undergoing seismic shifts. These changes affect economic structures, societal norms, and cultural identities, creating a complex landscape that demands nuanced understandings. The book explores the dimensions of feminization, its drivers, its impacts, and its implications for the future. From the rise of women in education and the workforce to the decline of male-dominated industries and the redefinition of masculinity in media, each chapter delves into how these changes are shaping modern life. We also highlight differences between countries, particularly the United States and Canada, providing a comparative lens to understand how policies, culture, and history influence these dynamics. The chapters cover everything from the impact of the birth control pill on empowerment, autonomy, abortion rates, the sexual revolution, gun violence, war deaths, male suicides, homelessness, declining marriage rates, education and workforce participation, woke policies, the economic shifts, media representation. It goes on and on. But when I got done, I had a conversation with my colleagues that said, you know, this is all by design. And I've resisted that because he's alluded to that in the past. But I had to put a second book together. So today I woke up at 4 o'clock, and by 6 o'clock I had written the sequel, which is called A Plot by Design, question mark. It notes that the 20th century has ushered in a cascade of societal shifts underpinned by the increasing influence of traditionally feminine values across our institutions, policies, and cultural norms. In the earlier sequel, we sought to understand the origins, the drivers, and the impacts, celebrating its strides towards equity while scrutinizing its unintended consequences. One question remained unexplored. Is feminization purely an organic evolution, trying to bring about that balance, or is it wielded as a tool for control? And that's what the book goes into, and it has a conclusion. So there's two dimensions to this. One is the relevance of feminization as a force of change in our society, which seems to be associated with or correlated in a way with male angst and rising relevance of females as we bring about this balance. But maybe it's gone too far. How does one know when enough is enough when it's an ideology? When do we have struck the right balance? And how do we maintain that balance in a changing world? So that's what I was hoping we might discuss today. And I know there's some familiar faces here. Some of you know exactly where I'm coming from and may well have in your own lives experienced some of the consequences of male frustration leading to suicide. One of the contributors to our homelessness webinar was a high school friend who was running a series of group homes in the southern US, whose son died of suicide. And it was shocking. And I remember being at a reunion and her sharing that with me, not emotionally, but as a transformation in her life. She was project manager in Boeing when Boeing was a decent company. But I was, and one of the brightest girls in our class in high school. I was shocked. And I've kept that relationship alive over the years, not out of empathy, but I think she had a lot to share that I needed to understand about when one goes through this issue touching them personally. To me, it's almost an intellectual exercise, although it has a bearing on my reason, probably for staying in Canada and having no interest in going back. So who wants to jump in? Go ahead, Barry.
Hey, I guess an initial observation is that uh, don't don't paint the United States as being much worse than Canada. Our sport is hockey. I love it. It's hardly passive. And we have a problem with our 20 something, let's say 35 and down males, that has to be addressed somehow. But we're not alone. The Japanese have the same problem, for example.
Well, they're having it in China as well. And interesting, in China, it's almost reversed. The high suicide rates are in young women.
That's interesting. I
Uh,
didn't know that.
But there is a difference between Canada and the US, and it's simply a difference of scale.
That's right. Yeah.
This transformation is underway, you're going to have that issue, but it's much more prevalent in the US than here. And whether it's due to history or whether it's due to political intervention, whether it's due to the fact that they have had wars and that they have had violence and they've had, you could see with the Black Lives Matter issue, it turned out to be violence on violence.
The biggest problem I think Canadians have is we believe we're lily white and pure. I don't say that's the belief of the people that are on the webinar, but we believe we're, as a society, we believe we're lily white and pure, and we're infected the same way others are.
In
Yeah.
the dialogue about Canada, the 51st state, very few people responded with a definition of what Canada is other than it is not the United States. It was very interesting discussion over the course of a couple of weeks to get a sense of how Canada's view its identity in a manner other than what it is not vis-a-vis the US. It has an issue of identity. And that's an issue of leadership. And I know the current prime minister wanted to purge July 1st, wanted to purge borders in his pursuit of postmodernism and a feminism agenda. There are many things perpetuated within this country over the last 15 years that are, again, in the interest of this policy of feminization of the society and purging it of hierarchies of competition.
Yeah. Okay. Let me.
Ruben, you want to jump in here? I know you made a comment, and then I'll go to Shirley. You made a comment earlier about
Turn down the
the
volume.
healthiness, the psychological value of having a discussion like this and bring it out into the open. Do you want to add anything from your research or your personal perspective?
Oh goodness. I want to reinforce how important. I mean, the one piece of consistent advice I have offered to a variety of people who get into serious conversations about the long-term evolution of modern Western cultures is don't do it alone. It's too dangerous. And I mean that literally. It's dangerous in the sense of psychologically dangerous to do it alone. It's also the case you shouldn't do it with folks who are just a cult. And so the trouble is, how do you find people who are others where the exploration is clear enough, deep enough, honest enough that you don't become a cult, but that you also don't get frightened by ideas that, in some deep sense, do frighten you. So I won't say more about that, but I just want to thank you for the work you've done in pulling people together in dialogue for years now. And for me, that's really important. It's certainly it's been a major feature in my own life. There's no virtue on my part that others have allowed me to be part of the conversation. Um, but
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to reflect just for a second. I got to know Ruben as a byproduct of him being a futurist at a time when I was involved in strategic planning for one of the government departments, which led us to thinking about, what is the future, what policies. Every time you budget, you give some thought to what's next year going to be. The interesting thing about futurism is nobody knows what the future really is, so it's a rather innocent exercise. You do run into people that just don't want to talk about the dark side, don't only want to talk about the bright, or don't even know how to talk about the sunshine coming up that's always cloudy. But those biases exist within any world, and to come to some collaborative agreement, as Greg would probably have called it, was always a challenge. So the process of forecasting is really a process, and the process is fascinating of what it brings out into people. But the fact that there are no guardrails and the fact that there's no policeman about talking about the future makes it a very healthy exercise. And one of the things that I really enjoy with this group is the capacity to explore without consequences. Nobody gets chastised. Nobody's shut down. I have called someone once after one of these events where they got a little bit carried away, but the culture of this group is, is unique in many ways. Shirley, you've got your hand up.
Well, also on the news today, they were saying a lot of these CEOs get paid 221% over a normal worker. They get paid in one day what a lot of people work for the entire year. A lot of this violence that's coming up, with that explosion with the Tesla vehicle, as well as some of this other violence, I think people are just getting fed up financially, especially in Canada with what's happening here with the rapid rise in inflation, and they can't see a way out of it. I think we're getting really, really frustrated with some of these enormously rich people like Trump and Elon Musk, telling everybody what to do and just flexing their muscles and having absolute power while others can't do anything. And I can understand why suicide rates are going up. I think people feel very helpless.
Hmm.
Okay, well, that puts the focus more on the issues of wealth inequities versus, although there is an element in that where when you talk about people of power, with money meaning power, and the way they use that power in order to take care of themselves as opposed to philanthropize. But people like Taylor Swift is a billionaire. She gives back. Gates has foundations. Buffett has foundations. The wealthy don't by design are not by design evil. Anyway, go ahead, Randall, you're up.
Yeah, I want to put this in the long-term perspective because I think one of the things we need to pay attention to is the traditional role of males in former civilizations, the hunters, the providers. That role has been diminished, undercut. I'm not going to take an opinion whether it's good or bad. The role of the traditional breadwinner has been eroded over the last 40 or 50 years, maybe more. And I think that, those males among us who are perhaps higher in testosterone probably are more inclined than to be feeling suppressed or repressed, and maybe inclined toward that kind of either violence or violence against oneself as a result of not feeling like they have a place in the world. It goes somewhat like Shirley is saying, a lot of us feel like, what's the point? It's so hard to make a decent living, and the inflation cuts back the value of our earned dollar. And so maybe a lot of people are kind of struggling with this, but more so the high testosterone males more than others. I'm just put it out there. I don't know.
Well, I think surely we can find points in time in history where there have been rich people. There were kings, there was the nobility, didn't necessarily lead to suicide. People had a place. If people are feeling displaced, it's because something that they expect, and it isn't to be rich, is not being fulfilled. And maybe it's Maslow's hierarchy; they just don't have enough food to eat. But I gather that these people that are committing suicide are really not necessarily poor. They're college students. They're people coming back from war that may well have post-traumatic syndrome. But I'm not quite sure that Elon Musk being a billionaire is really bothering a hell of a lot of people. I know the media makes the point, but do you really feel, Shirley, depressed because Elon Musk is a billionaire? I doubt it.
That whole scene, that whole scene is so depressing for so many people. The whole Trump election, the Elon Musk chipping in there and buying up representation in their government, like now he's sticking his nose into Germany. Now
But who really I mean, on a personal level, when you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth and you take a shower and you go to your job, is that something you really worry about? Or do you worry about Maslow's hierarchy, whether you got food in the fridge and whether or not you have a role, whether or not your role as a man is any longer relevant?
yeah, but,
or
but that,
your emotionality and your expressions of feelings anybody gives a damn about?
well, I weigh that day of the American election, and I'll tell you, at the end of it all, I felt a deep, deep depression. I thought this is heading towards a really terrible bust up of all the values that we hold dear.
Okay, and we've talked about Trump being the bad guy. When we talk about, manners
Well,
matter, and
yeah,
bad manners seem to matter a lot, and yet he got elected.
yeah,
And he got elected because something about that character represented power that people wanted, and they say that one of the male characteristics is a readiness to address power, and females would rather shut it down. And that distinction is one of the things defining why it was that Trump got elected.
yeah. Well,
He's an embodiment of the characteristic classic male.
yeah.
Whether we agree with that or not, whether we are classic males ourselves, I don't know. Go ahead, Ruben.
Yeah, I get nervous about conversations. I mean, so this is a statement about me. I get nervous about conversations that treat history as if it doesn't matter,
Okay.
and, as if, in fact, being male has always been the same thing.
Hmm.
Oh, even Randall's comment about hunters, the actual research is that uh, in indigenous cultures, before we got a hold of them, hunting and activities were remarkably gender independent.
Hmm.
Women had roles in hunting and men had roles in raising children. And the kind of images we have, most of the crap that we hear about indigenous people is just, I mean, decent research doesn't back it. And indigenous, I mean, in the same way, Perry, you've said that nobody's talking about this. Well, the fact is, there's a fairly extensive literature on the issue of not just the emerging role of women, but on the evolution of modern techno-industrial cultures, which is what we in Canada and the US and other OECD countries are. Um, and so I just want us to not be careless by saying things that are commonly said in our culture.
But I'm not sure they're commonly said. I know there's a fair amount of research, but I don't think this discussion we're having now about feminization and the implications for our society and the high death rates among young males is being discussed.
No, I agree with that. What I'm saying is commonly said is that there's kind of a male role that's ahistorical. It's been the same in every form of civilization, and
Yeah.
that's simply, the research doesn't support that.
Mhm.
And I agree that the conversation that you're getting at, I mean, the thing we face is, in one sense, it's a classic scientific conundrum. in that we've got data that we're trying to make sense of by a hypothesis that accounts for more data more completely and more fully and more interestingly. And we live in a culture in which this kind of conversation is not even encouraged.
Right.
It's not encouraged in universities by and large. I mean, there are, as we all know, there have been courses in women's studies that have emerged in the 80s and 90s, and they're among the courses that are now being discontinued. I mean, broadly speaking, the humanities are being abandoned, and women's studies and this kind of conversation, even universities, is diminishing as people focus on studies that connect them more deeply to the economy. So I'm all in favor of raising the question. I just want us not, as we talk about it, take cultural stereotypes as if they're facts.
Well, I mean, it's hard to have a cultural stereotype other than I think you can have a national stereotype. I
Well,
think but and even there is you obviously have diversity. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The United States is not homogeneous by any means. In fact, that's probably one of its values is that degree of diversity and the tension. But when that tension leads to violence as a way of resolving the angst of that transformation, that's to me culturally unacceptable. And yet I'm not, don't call me a feminist or LGBTQ. I just don't see violence as being acceptable as a means of resolving conflict during a transformation. That's a revolution. And I think the US is teetering on it. And I don't mean a revolution in the classical sense. I think it's coming from within. And I think the frustrations that exist in the US, whether it be wealth inequity, as Shirley points out, or this issue of feminism having gone too far, something is going on. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so this is such a complicated topic because there are so many different facets. And just in a few minutes, I wrote down a few that came to mind. So the gun culture, wealth inequity, drug culture, and that's opioids, alcohol, fentanyl, and other addictions like gambling and consumer debt. The cost of living is unbelievable. Like I can't imagine graduating high school and the average house in Calgary costs over $400,000. How do you? I mean, and you're carrying like $100,000 student loan or something like that. It's unbelievable. So that's a part of being economically trapped. Then there's racial tensions, religious tensions, stress of living, of course, immigrant culture. And so we used to feel like there was some sort of a Canadian culture, and that seems to be breaking down as we get more people moving into the country. And we're not the typical melting pot like the United States used to be. I don't know if you could still consider them to be. So just the basic stresses of living, and then you got, people have health concerns, you have relationship concerns, and the breakdown of the nuclear family, and then we were talking about also cultural values changing with feminism, wokeism, Black Lives Matter, trans culture, all of these things. So we're being like, we have so many inputs and social media. We don't know how having access to all this information is affecting us. There's just so much coming at us. It's no wonder that people are feeling overstressed.
So what we have been talking about in 2024, we called it global chaos, but much of that attention was at that global macro level. What I'm doing today is taking it down, as Shirley would point out, to the personal level. Why are people stressed with a event in New Orleans? But why are we now, as global citizens, living our lives with more stress, probably than ever before, because we are now part of the globalization movement that says we all need to be emotionally sensitive to life and death that exists any place on the planet?
I think we need to be aware of what's going on in the world, but You know, it's interesting. Peter Diamandis called CNN the crisis news network, and it's basically that whole idea of you know, they want your eyeballs for advertising,
Sure.
but there's much more good news in the world than we're getting access to.
But
And
that doesn't get eyeballs, does it?
exactly.
And so I had a conversation on New Year's Eve with my daughter-in-law. My daughter-in-law does not get the newspaper anymore. She does not listen to CNN. They have shut off their newspaper. They've shut off their TV. Their kids are not being exposed. They are living the life of a family, raising that family as a byproduct of events that are significant to them and the world that they live in. And that world is defined by what they can see, touch, and use. They have
Sounds,
bailed out. Now,
sounds like a healthy approach.
we used to call it family, that the family played a protector role and the father played a protector role. And we had protections in our immediate environment because we knew there were stresses in the world at large, whether it was the temperature or whether it was the climate and the farming and what would happen next season. We had in that family a form of protection that a child could grow up feeling safe and secure until such time as they could stand up on their own. Okay, maybe that's historical. I know when I was talking to the School of Social Work in Calgary, they said that's archaic. It doesn't exist anymore. We're part of a nuclear world family. The family's dead. I was shocked, and I've never forgot that moment because I felt somebody on earth felt that that was true and that that was where we were headed, and that as a futurist, I should be paying attention. And I think there are those in the world that believe in postmodernism, that we now are part of a global world. We're not going to shut it down. The internet is not going to die. And we as human beings need to learn how to adapt as global citizens. Boy, that hurts. United Nations would say as much. Go ahead, Tommy. Or Yogi, I'm sorry, Yogi. Yogi, you're muted.
You know, there's no question that dramatic changes are happening, and there are many factors at play, and the influence of social media on children has been widely discussed, and the breakdown of the family, I think, is a serious issue. And particularly those, you know, there was just a discussion that suggested maybe the family is passé. Well, if the family is passé, you've got to replace it with something. And perhaps some of these higher suicide rates are related to the fact that these individuals aren't sure of what their role is in society, at work, relationships with others, relationships with families, and I guess if you have none of the above, that puts you at significant risk towards suicide. Or like the guy in just over the weekend in New Orleans, he was clearly expressing his frustrations with many aspects of his life in a horrible way. Um, I, you know, maybe this isn't politically correct, but if he would have certainly been better off for the rest of society if he had committed suicide in a corner somewhere rather than inflict this devastation on others.
Well,
And
he did commit suicide. He was willing to sacrifice his life for a cause that he felt was because there were those that don't believe in his religion, that was sinful. At one time, we used to crucify such people.
yeah, so
But on this point of if the family and that structure that I referred to that historically used to play a role of protection is gone, there is something to replace it. And that's what the postmodernists and that's what many of the feminists say. And that's the state, that the government has a role to take to protect and take care of these people.
well, and maybe some people think that the state is a good idea, but I sure don't. You know,
Well,
even in the most positive view of what government is capable of, it isn't this.
Yogi, not to embarrass, what percentage of your income do you give to the state?
Well, I'm assuming it's over 30%. It might be 50.
Well, then you obviously have a fair level of trust that the state will do good things for the public at large. And you personally are prepared to make a significant sacrifice in the interest that the state does good things. And maybe the state can do good health, can take care of your health, take care of your education, and maybe take care of your family.
Okay, so maybe I'm being contradictory here.
Well, I'm looking.
It's a
it's all
good point,
done.
though.
This
Thank
is
you, Perry.
It's all
Th-
done in the spirit of exploring something, but you have touched on something that periodically I wonder about. You know, Canadians are prepared to give up a significant amount of their earnings. They say until July, you're working for the state.
They are. I'm astonished by how often a problem comes up and the chorus of responses is, gee, what can we have the government do for this?
It troubles me whenever I hear someone complaining and saying, well, I'm going to take that to my MLA, because all they've done is said, I am now going to empower the state to be responsible for solving that problem.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
we have a pothole on the side of a street that I drive on every day, and I used to put one of those little orange uh, warning signs out on it, and then it would disappear, and then I put one of these little red stags on it, and then I called the government. I said to the government, look, you know, someone's going to hit that pothole, and they're going to be, you know, hit the tree that's behind it. You ought to fill that pothole. And 3 or 4 months later, it was filled. So I trusted that the government was filing. This year, they put asphalt on it. Every time I drive by it, I think, oh, I'm so happy we have a government to take care of our streets. So anyway, there's,
well, you know, and I
I'm
think,
ringing in 2025 with a positive view about government. It did
okay,
a great
but
job
so
with the
potholes is a good example of something that government can do well. Rearing children with reasonable values, I just struggle to believe that that's somehow a good role for government.
Well, they tried it with the residential schools, and they certainly did it with the scoop proposal. And I can remember being inside social services and community health when that was initiated in Manitoba, and some thought it was a good thing that the state was stepping in because that population didn't seem to be doing a very good thing for its kids. Now we're paying the price of them not having good parent roles to be good parents. That is a very complex dilemma. And I'm not going to wade into it at this moment, but I think it is symptomatic again of whether or not the state really does have the wherewithal in order to achieve the resolution of personal problems. Like that's core to the discussions we have, the extent to which public issues can be, or personal issues can be resolved with a public resolution. I am biased. My confirmation bias is that people have more resilience than we give them credit for, and we should spend more time building resilience, which is the masculine role, in people so that they can do a better job for themselves and their kids and build a stronger society from the bottom up, instead of always going to the state and saying, I got a problem, solve it. Get the money out of Elon Musk's. I could care less about solving that problem. Go ahead, Ruben.
Well, I just want to object to your assumption that resilience is a masculine role.
Okay.
Women are extraordinarily resilient.
Well, I don't disagree there.
And would be dead within 10 years of the marriage vows. They are far more adaptive than we are, and so I mean, again, I one of the things that I would add is just a kind of meta observation that the conversation we're having is largely taking place within the frames of reference of a modern techno-industrial understanding of reality and life. So that even the distinction between public and private, the way, you know, personal and the state, that's a distinction that didn't exist in history until the 1600s. The CBC, God bless it, did a 16-part series on the radio to explore this using the research that was being done at the time, a multi-year project at McGill University. So I guess all I'm saying is my bias would be statements from all of us that probe into this as a puzzlement, to say this is what puzzles me, rather than making assertions as if we actually know what we're talking about.
Oh, yeah,
I don't think I mean, it's one of the features of modernity that we don't know that we're modern, and we don't understand the ways in which our own formation as modern people, men and women, affect how we see the world and how we respond to it. And part of what's going on is not just a transition to postmodernity, as you talked about that, as if that's a negative thing, um, but in fact, a realization that postmodernity is not a space you can build a culture in, that you can build a life in, that it's a space that has other utilities, and I won't bother with them now. But there's, for me, from my point of view, there's a really interesting conversation going on around the world. It's very much at the margins, so that it's not, the Calgary, there's no Canadian newspaper that carries this stuff.
mhm, mhm.
The papers that carry it are occasionally the New York Times, far more the Atlantic, and if you want a newspaper in English, it's the Guardian.
Yeah.
There are some German newspapers, but my grandfather spoke German, but that gene I didn't inherit it. So I can't do more than say Bleistift, which sounds as if a wonderful swear word. It actually means pencil.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more with regard to the fact that our dialogues are very much within the Western sphere. If we were having this discussion in Iran, where there's a theocracy, it would be very, very different. Or if we were having the discussion in Iran before the theocracy, it would be
Well, if we were having this discussion with Leroy Little Bear, who's one of the elders of the Blood tribe in southern Alberta, who is well known among people who are in conversation about the differences between the underlying perceptions and responses to reality of modernity and those of Indigenous people. And he's one of the Indigenous people who understand that conversation enough that it's worthwhile being in conversation with him. The book that I would direct you to is by David Peat, and it's called Blackfoot Physics.
Mhm.
David was a theoretical physicist, a student of David Bohm's, if you know that name, and he spent a summer with Leroy Little Bear and wrote the book Blackfoot Physics as an attempt to say to those of us who are modern, here's another way of making sense of reality, and therefore how you respond to it. And I only mention this because, Perry, I think the thing that needs to be said about this moment in history is that your intuition that something very profound is going on, I think, is quite right. In other words, I think there's a growing conversation that suggests that one of the deep dynamics of history at this moment is that the modern grip on reality is actually loosening. That people who are modern don't believe it as much, and it's not as successful as it used to be, and we're in kind of psychological free fall. So let me just give you one other piece of data that you can add to your data. I don't think it maps onto feminization, but it does map onto caring for people's personal life. So when I was an undergraduate at Queen's, they did have a small capacity in terms of student health to deal with people who would be deemed at the time to be reasonably seriously mentally stressed.
Mhm.
If you look at last Friday's Globe and Mail, one of the feature stories on page 1 that goes on to page 6, so that it's not, this is current data, and one of the diagrams it shows is that at Queen's University, universities today in Canada typically, half the students are suffering from some psychological stresses that in my time they would have been assigned a psychiatrist, but there's no university in the world, not even Harvard, has enough resources to assign healthcare to half the student population.
Look, you touched on a very relevant issue in the 60s when I was in government and mental health was one of my departments. The psychiatrist said there is no such thing as mental health issues for children. We didn't have a child's mental health. Today, it's one of the most significant. I don't mean autism. I mean everything from depression to high levels of anxiety to becoming non-functional. This was not apparent at that time and was denied as being even relevant. Today, it's one of the primary drivers of mental health is what are we going to do with our youth? So something is going on where they either feel they don't belong, and one needs to be careful even interpreting the problem, but among our youth, belonging, meaningful, having a future. What do I study? Is my family secure? My mom is a drug addict. My dad, I mean, the chaos of growing up in this global society has really challenged the capacity of the family to fulfill the capacity to protect a child. Emotionally, not just in terms of food, the state may be able to give them food, but can they give them emotional support? Is that relevant to the growing of a child when the state says, "Oh, we'll feed you, we'll give you dental care"?
You got to know that in the 1940s and 50s in Calgary, the Calgary Board of Education had a milk program for students who would come in the 40s to school hungry because teachers understood even then that there's no nutrition in your body. The odds of learning anything are pretty slim.
Yes.
And so part of my experience was the milkman would come into every class and put an assigned number of pints of milk, just there were pints, not quarts, pints of milk on the runway that you see underneath a blackboard, where the blackboard brushes would be, because that was wide enough you could put a pint of milk there and it would lean against the blackboard. And in most classes, it was somewhere between 3 and 5 pints. So that kind of caring, I mean, the poor laws in England go back to the 15th century. So, I mean, I want to be careful about talking about the state as if it's something totally, as if we understand it and as if it's totally other. The fact is, in a democracy, the mythology is that we who are citizens share a responsibility for the state, and to even talk of the state as them as opposed to us is, in fact, an abandonment of our citizenship.
Correct.
And
My response to this is, however, to expect the state to be our protector
what
is
what
an overextension of the role of the state.
well, that becomes a conversation. I mean, among among many people in Canada, the view you've expressed is taken for granted. It would be supported by and large by the UCP caucus and by the folks in Alberta who by and large have voted conservative, which is almost forever. I mean, the United Farmers of Alberta were defeated in 1935.
But my comment, and I've said this to everyone from prime ministers down, is could you please go to Ottawa today and do less? Because you continue to assume responsibilities that were once the citizens.
I'm
And
not.
it's called overprotection, and it is this feminization thing begins to emerge again because in an environment where you are, quote, overprotected, sending kids to institutions where they never had broken bones, but they never had any life experience either, and were totally dependent, or putting a kid in a closet and saying you're safe and coming back when he's age 6 after being fed and having no skills whatsoever, is clearly developmentally eroding. And I think we as a society need to wake up to the fact that something is going on with our youth, which some call inadequate protection and others say is overprotection. And maybe it's a little bit of each.
And it may be neither. It may be that as a culture, if it is the case that the modern take on reality, which is a take that began to emerge in the 12th century and got developed bit by bit over the last about 800 years. And eventually technology entered the picture, but most of a modern mindset was developed without reference to technology other than the printing press.
Right.
1450 with the movable type. And that's important because it was critical to the Protestant Reformation. Without the printing press, the Protestants wouldn't have had a hope of making a difference in Europe or in any other part of the world. But what I don't dispute that something fundamental is going on and that we actually need to probe into it. What I'm resisting is that the way you're framing it is already adequate. And so what I'm asking you, as well as the rest of us, is to treat your understanding of this as one hypothesis.
Yeah, no, if I have made that if I've made that, I apologize, that's wrong. My conclusion in the book is we need to watch this.
Well,
Something is out of balance.
we need to probe into it as if it actually matters, because I absolutely agree. Stuff is going on that is not healthy and is going to get worse. Let me just give you one other statistic from the story in the Globe. When I was at university, there were no trigger warnings. And everybody knows what a trigger warning is, that if you're teaching a class, you have to say, I'm now going to say something that might upset some of you and that might trigger. You've had an experience in your past that, if I'm casual about it, will trigger a memory of trauma, and you'll be traumatized in a way that I didn't intend, and nor did you intend, and I should be respectful of the actual history that you've had as a person coming into the class. So at one level, trigger warnings make sense. The trouble is, universities now have formal ways in which a student who's been traumatized can go and get a certificate that they are, in a sense, students who need to be respected as potentially subject to trauma. And if you're teaching a class of 100 people and there's 4 students in the class, you can cope with that as a teacher, because you have to treat them in a different way. You have to give them different examinations. There's a whole variety of things. But at Queen's University, which is my university, the story happens to talk about Queen's data, which is one of the reasons it caught my attention. 22% of Queen's students now have such certificates. And faculty are saying, in effect, how do I teach when 20% of the students I have to worry about in some way? So I can't teach in any kind of a normal way that universities have been universities for several hundred years. And I take this seriously as an issue that it's.
I take that very, I mean, you've just given an example of what I think is much broader than simply that. I think the whole clash right now between public interest and private interests have become so excessive, so toxic, that the search for an answer, that's what we've been doing for 20 years with these webinars, is trying to find where that balance is, in the belief that there may be a new form of governance even emerging. There may be, and maybe that's what the role that AI is ultimately going to play is, in that classroom, everybody's got their AI, and they'll know when to shut off the speaker when he's potentially going to talk about something problematic, because it can do forecasting. I don't want to get off track with this. We've got only a few more minutes. Ruben, thank you. I'm going to cut you off there just for a second. I want to hear what Tom's got to share.
Yeah, I just, in all this discussion, I worked most of my career in television. And when I set out in television, I had very high ideals about what I wanted to achieve and the power of media and all that stuff. And we had maybe 3-4 channels in Canada. Now we have everywhere, TV coming from everywhere. And it's, like today I was watching the story on the guy with the Tesla truck. And, they've got the whole bit on it. They've got cameras following the truck. They got all of that stuff going on. So somebody who, you know, is set out to find out what's going on, they get such detail, and it's so depressing. And it also, the big issue with media is portraying the stereotypes. Everybody has to be really fit, has to be really muscular, has to go and do all sorts of things. But primarily, they live rich lives, most of them, on these TV shows. And I think that's really got a detrimental effect on modern society.
Okay, well, we're into wrap up. We've reflected on what we've been reflecting on almost for 20 years, which is that this tension and trying to get a handle on it. Often we talk about the difficulties human beings are having in this transition driven by emerging technologies at such a rate. Now we have AI, or we had the pill in the 60s. We had no idea what the consequences ultimately were going to be of the pill, and it clearly has advanced feminization and transformations of society. I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad. It's a fact, and it's happened just as the printing press happened. And wars have happened, and famines have happened, and floods have happened, and people have survived. So men and women are resilient. Families have added to that resilience. Communities have added that resilience. But many of these institutional structures that we've come in are Western, and the church played a role at one time. But many of these institutions that we've come to rely on, and possibly the state as well, even though it's getting huge taxes, doesn't seem to be handling particularly well the sociogramic shifts of migration, the technological shifts of AI, the environmental shifts of climate change, the governance shift of having to regulate the markets. All these things are forces and sources of change arriving simultaneously at a rate that in itself is an issue. It challenges our personal resilience. It begs us to have networks for conversations, I think, like this, so we can express and look around and maybe see someone who we want to follow up with and have further discussions with, because it's comforting. I know Shirley and I have been through a few of those when it goes back to some of the issues which we face together and personally and in a club and in community. So these networks are more than just a dialogue. We reach out to share. To be human is to feel, not just to think. And I'm glad we've shared this conversation with each and every one of you. So, Randall, let's call that a wrap up. There's often post party if anybody wants to hang around for a little bit.